Any of the jurors have any difficulty following the instructions not to talk about the case among yourselves or with anybody else during the recess? None of the jurors have answered affirmatively. Can you check in my office, please? Okay, yes, please, Mrs. Douglas.
Now, Doctor, I just want to go back for a moment, Dr. Kincher. Dr. Kincher, you talked about sort of the rarity of the response you would have to a child who was experiencing psychosis at age 10. Is that correct?
Yes.
How long do you expect that a child of that age would be able to keep anyone from realizing what was wrong with that child?
That would ordinarily be a matter of weeks to perhaps a handful of months, largely because of the deterioration in functioning across a number of the child's different domains. Often shows up first in peer relationships and schoolwork and withdrawal in the family. But a period of 4 years where there was not this kind of indication of deterioration of function would be extremely, extremely rare.
Now, Doctor, you also
in fact, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. It would be both rare, and it would not allow the child to actually meet the qualifying criteria for the diagnosis, because the child wouldn't be manifesting the deterioration of functioning that is required for giving the diagnosis in the first place.
If the disease was progressing sufficiently to meet the diagnosis, there's no way anyone could miss it. Is that correct?
Objection, leading.
Well, I'll sustain the objection.
Can you explain again, Doctor?
Yes, the diagnosis of schizophrenia requires a period of active, observable symptoms or reported symptoms for at least 6 months, a briefer time if the person has been identified earlier and is under treatment. But the hallmark of the disorder is its impairments in functioning across a variety of different life domains. In children, most importantly, school, peer relationships, and family relationships.
Now, Doctor, you also talked about that you have worked with children experiencing acute psychosis, including auditory hallucinations. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And what are the kinds of questions you ask when making an assessment as to the reliability of someone reporting auditory hallucinations?
I will take a history of the experiences of auditory hallucination, age of onset, pattern. Do they wax and wane? Are they pretty consistent? So age of onset, pattern. Are they inside the head, outside the head? What are they saying? Are the voices saying things that are negative and insulting? Are the voices more grandiose and telling you how fabulous you are? Are the voices frightening to the child? Are the voices directing them to behave in particular ways? I will also look to see whether or not when the child experiences them, how distracting they are for the child. For many children, if they have one or more voices going on in their head, they find it difficult to pay attention to what's going on outside of them. I will look to see whether or not other persons with whom this child lives or interacts has noticed this kind of internal absorption or noticed them frequently talking to themselves or responding to parties that don't seem to be there, self-reports to other people.
And what are the kinds of the things you've just described? What are the kind of red flags you might hear that would make you wonder if the report of voices was accurate?
Amongst the things that would raise a red flag for me are differences in report as to age of onset, the circumstances under which they began, significant variations in the course that they have taken since their onset, significant variations as to what the voices are saying, how many voices, if that changes over time, who those voices may represent. For example, are they people in their real life, but they now see them or hear them when they're not present? Are they sort of amorphous, unidentified voices? They're not quite sure who they are, or sometimes they're muffled, even what they're saying. Are they the voices of aliens or fantastic creatures or animals or whatever it is that they're identifying them as? So one of the things that I'm looking for is consistency of report, particularly where that consistency of report is also consistent with what we know about the unfolding of the disease process and the ways in which these voices tend to, for example, intensify at times when people are showing other signs of distress or illness. They naturally sort of wax and wane over time.
Now, Doctor, returning to your evaluation of Philip Chism, you indicated just now that one of the things you would want to consider in any evaluation is those people who have lived with the individual. Is that correct?
That's correct.
In this case, were you able to speak with the person with whom Philip Chism was living at the time of the offense?
I was not.
And why was that?
She declined to speak with me.
And she being whom?
His mother.
Now, did you, I think you've indicated you had an opportunity to view surveillance video from Danvers High School. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And was the video from Danvers High School significant to your ultimate opinion in this case?
It was.
And Doctor, if I could direct your attention to the screen where Exhibit 51, I expect will momentarily be placed. And Doctor, specifically, did you view video of Philip Chism arriving at school the morning of October 22nd?
Yes, or it seemed to be that's what was happening, either arriving at school or coming down towards a class.
If we could play the first video. Doctor, was there anything significant to you in forming your opinion regarding the video that we've just played from Exhibit 51 of Mr. Chism walking down the hall?
Not at that point. I simply noted how he was dressed, the color of his sweatshirt, and he was apparently in possession of 3 bags.
And did you also view video of Mr. Chism's movements in the school immediately prior to Ms. Ritzer's last period class that day?
Yes.
If we could move to that video. I don't have that number. If we could move to video. I apologize, Your Honor. No, 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 no. Back. Sorry. The video on the screen, do you recognize this video as video you considered in reaching your ultimate opinion, Doctor?
Yes.
And again, was this video from which you could draw any conclusions alone, or was it only in context of other images that you watched?
Only in context. I would, on that particular video, be noting his demeanor and behavior.
And if we could move. Doctor, fair to say you're familiar with this video?
Yes.
And Doctor, the video of Mr. Chism following Ms. Ritzer down the hall, was that video significant to your ultimate opinion in this case regarding his criminal responsibility?
Yes. First, I note the change of clothing to a hooded sweatshirt. I note that he comes out of the classroom. He looks in both directions up and down the hall. From that, I infer that he was possibly looking to see if there were other people in the hall who might observe him. He looked briefly up at the surveillance camera area, stepped back into the classroom, reemerged with the hood up over his face, over his head, from which I inferred that he may be attempting to obscure his identity as he moves out into the hall and follows her.
And how do those observations play into your specific analysis as to whether he understood the wrongfulness of his conduct and could conform his conduct to the requirements of the law on October 22nd?
Obscuring his identity and making sure that there were not people in the hall who would observe him leave would be consistent with an inference that he appreciated the wrongfulness of his conduct because he didn't want to be observed behaving in a way that might lead people to be concerned or suspicious or later to place him at the scene. The fact that he made decisions to check out the hallway before finally exiting, made a second decision actually in that process to get back into the classroom and put the hood up over his face and to walk out with his head down so that it would be more difficult to identify him. Suggested to me also an appreciation of wrongfulness, but also the fact that he was making calculated decisions for a rational purpose in a continuing course of conduct.
If we could play the next video. And then the next video. And the next. And the next. Doctor, the series of videos that just played of Colleen Ritzer crossing the landing, the defendant crossing the landing, and then each of them entering the bathroom, was that series of videos significant to you in forming your opinion regarding Mr. Chism's criminal responsibility?
Yes, it was.
Could you explain that, please?
First, he continued to obscure his identity by keeping the hood pulled up over his head as he was walking forward. He also appears to be carrying a pair of gloves and pausing briefly to put them on prior to entering the bathroom. The obscuring of his identity suggests that he still appreciates the wrongfulness of his conduct, or at least that others would appreciate it was wrong. And so hiding his identity. The procuring of the gloves, I think, permits an inference that as he was following her, he had prepared himself in advance with gloves, and potentially an inference that he was doing so both to perhaps minimize the amount of blood that he might get on his hand as in an attack, or, and these are not mutually exclusive, or to prevent fingerprints of his later to be retrievable from the bathroom where the attack would occur.
And how are those two inferences relevant to the second two prongs of whether he understood the wrongfulness of his conduct and can conform his behavior.
The obscuring of his identity and the placing of the gloves, if intended to keep his fingerprints from being detectable at the scene of the attack, would suggest that he was aware of the wrongfulness or criminality of his act. The fact that he had acquired gloves and put them on prior to the attack suggests a degree of forethought which requires planning, and if that is the correct inference, would suggest rational decision-making in the course of a continued course of conduct.
If we could move to the next two videos. Actually, the next three. I apologize, Mr. Langston. Dr. Kinshirf, you viewed those next three videos, and did they, in concert with the account of Ms. Bedard, impact your opinion in this particular case?
Yes.
And how so?
Ms. Bedard reported that she had entered the bathroom in order to make a cell phone call due to the acoustics in the hall, and that as she entered, she had seen the naked buttocks of an individual in the bathroom. She, as a result of seeing that, had immediately turned around and gone out of the bathroom.
And then, based on the videos of the timing at which the defendant then exits the bathroom, was that significant to you in any way?
It was. My recollection is that at this point, the defendant and Ms. Ritzer had been in the bathroom for about 6 minutes. Her entry into the bathroom and his prompt departure suggests to me that he may well have been concerned about detection, that she may have seen something, may have gone to get people, particularly if he was partially nude when she observed him. And his prompt departure would be consistent, depending upon what he does next here, with a continued course of action. Leaving the scene where he may have been identified by a witness is consistent with appreciating the wrongfulness of his act, or that others would see it was wrong. And leaving would also be a rational continuation of a course of conduct if you did not want to get caught.
If we could play the next series of videos. And the next. Now, Dr. Kinshirf, did that series of videos combined with your knowledge of the account of Carolyn Quigley's observations of Mr. Chism in that area just adjacent to the school, did those impact at all your opinion regarding his criminal responsibility?
Yes, they did.
How so?
I noted that he was leaving the scene where the attack occurred. He continued to have both his hood up and his face down and away from the cameras. He was carrying something in his hands. As he entered the bathroom with the two gloves, it wasn't clear to me that he was carrying anything at all, but now as he exits, he's carrying something out of the bathroom with him. If those were either his articles of clothing or those of Ms. Ritzer, it would be reasonable to infer that he was trying to take them from the scene to avoid identification or detection.
And to the best of your knowledge, does he then continue to have those in his hands after he is seen by Miss Quigley in the shrub area adjacent to the school?
The best of my recollection is that after being in the shrub area as identified by Ms. Quigley, he's no longer carrying those items.
And if he concealed any of the items he was carrying in that shrub area, would that impact your opinion regarding his criminal responsibility?
Yes.
How so?
It would suggest that he's trying to obscure his involvement in this activity by both removing items from the scene and also getting rid of them before he would be seen carrying them around for a considerable period of time, perhaps seen by other people.
And how do those inferences impact your opinion, specifically regarding his ability to conform his conduct to the requirements of the law?
He is showing a decision that is in furtherance of his course of conduct here to evade detection and to obscure evidence of the crime and his involvement.
Now, Doctor, you are aware both from video and the account of an encounter that Mr. Chism has soon hereafter with Ramsey S. Garcia. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And was there anything significant to you regarding the interaction he had with Ramsey S. Garcia?
Yes. Ramsey came upon the defendant. He was looking for him because he was tardy for soccer practice. Ramsey describes Mr. Chism as looking frightened, swearing, sweating, looking concerned. Ramsey asked him what he was doing. He said that he had lost something. Ramsey offered to help him look for it. The defendant said no. He again offered to assist the defendant in looking for whatever it was that he had lost. The defendant again said no and directed Ramsey to return to the soccer field and that he would join him there later.
And how is that exchange significant to you in forming your opinion?
I think it supports an inference that Mr. Chism appreciated the wrongfulness of his act, or at least that Ramsey was likely to consider it to be wrong or criminal. He was intentionally misleading a friend in order to draw him away from joining Mr. Chism. He did so twice, and he then directed his friend to go to a place that would be not proximate to his continued course of action. This, I think, reflects, permits the inference of an appreciation of wrongfulness, but also that he is making decisions in a continued course of conduct, which are understandable.
And Dr. Kinshirf, while we're talking about Ramsey S. Garcia, did you also have an opportunity to take into account the accounts of Autumn Ciani, who was in the classroom just before Mr. Chism followed Ms. Ritzer into the bathroom?
Yes, I did.
And was her account of her observations of the defendant significant to you in any way?
Yes.
How so?
On two counts. One, she described an interaction between Ms. Ritzer and Mr. Chism in which Mr. Chism appeared to have become annoyed with her, but that the incident appeared to sort of have de-escalated as she changed the topic to other matters, and that while Ms. Ritzer was briefly out of the room, she had interacted at the whiteboard with the defendant, and he didn't seem to be particularly out of normal, if you will. He was not visibly distressed or upset or emotionally dysregulated.
And returning to the video, if we could play the next couple of clips. could play one more. I lied, two more. The series of clips you just watched, and certainly you had seen before, Dr. Kinshirf, of Mr. Chism bringing the recycling barrel into the bathroom and then leaving the bathroom in the school with the recycling barrel, was that series of clips significant to you in forming your opinion regarding Mr. Chism's criminal responsibility?
Yes.
How so?
At the beginning of the sequence, Mr. Chism has changed out of the hooded sweatshirt and is now back into the red sweatshirt that does not have a hood. If during the course of the initial attack on Ms. Ritzer, he had injured her in a way that had led her to bleed, it would support an inference that he changed out sweatshirts, at least in part, to not be walking around with a sweatshirt with visible blood on it. I also noted that in part of the hallway, he was walking with his face mask up. I understand that this is an area of the school which is pretty empty at that time of day, but I think him pulling the barrel with a face mask up permits an inference that had he come across somebody unexpectedly, he would have wanted to have his identity obscured with the mask. Apparently, he continues to go into the bathroom, comes out with the barrel, seems to be physically managing the barrel at least a little bit, comes out of the building. As he comes out of the building, he has lowered the balaclava, the face mask. That would permit an inference that he appreciated that if he were to be seen wandering away from the scene of a crime with a face mask, that might draw the concern or suspicions of individuals, and that a student pulling a barrel would probably be less noticeable to potential witnesses than one pulling a barrel out of a building with a face mask on.
And those inferences and observations together, how do they affect specifically the issue of him understanding the wrongfulness of his conduct and being able to conform his conduct to the law?
If he was, in fact, removing the body, if that is determined to be a matter of fact, then he is engaging in a course of conduct to take the body from the scene. The manner in which he does it is done in a manner to sort of lower his risks of being identified in doing so, both in obscuring his identity when he might come across somebody unexpectedly, but also by removing the face mask from his face when he's out in an environment where the face mask itself would have drawn concern or suspicion. If the barrel was also used to transport any of her belongings or his from the scene, it would be further evidence of both appreciation of wrongfulness, because he would not want to have been identified, but also a continuing course of action in the commission of the crime, which is rational in its purposes.
Now, Doctor, you're familiar with the account of Emily Roach, who ultimately sees the defendant with the barrel up sort of behind the field house. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And was his account significant to you at all?
Emily Roach's account?
Yes.
Yes.
Sorry, hers. Sorry.
That's fine. I just want to make sure I have his understanding correctly. Yes, she noticed the defendant, as he tried to maneuver the barrel up the hill with some considerable difficulty. She, at the time, did not give it a great deal of thought. She thought that he was perhaps one of the members of the maintenance crew taking a recycling barrel out into the wooded area. She noted him struggling with the barrel as he was trying to go up an incline and eventually bringing the barrel back down and moving in another direction. From that, I inferred that there was a reasonable probability that her body and perhaps his or her belongings were in the barrel, accounting for the weight as he tried to get it up the hill.
Now, Dr. Kinshirf, you are familiar with the condition of Ms. Ritzer's body when she was located in the woods, is that correct?
That's correct.
And is there anything about, and you're also familiar with the location of various pieces of clothing and the defendant's backpack in the woods, is that correct?
That's correct.
Did you have an opportunity to view those woods and the locations where certain items were found yourself personally?
I did.
In total, those items I've just listed, did the condition of Ms. Ritzer's body as well as the setting in the woods and where things were located, was that significant in forming your ultimate opinion in this case?
Yes, it was.
And how so?
In a couple of ways. First, the condition of her body suggested or indicated that she had been subject to what is referred to as overkill. Overkill is inflicting damage onto a victim that would be beyond what is necessary to render them incapable of defending themselves, such as unconsciousness or death. It is also associated with very, very high emotional arousal, especially if it is targeting the face or other significant part of the body, face, neck area, breast areas. Hers were limited largely to the neck area, as I understand it. The stick that was found with her body and the indications that there was blood at the tip of the stick suggested a vaginal insertion. This is a very low rate behavior in sexual assaults. It typically indicates the desire of the assailant to feel as though they have humiliated the victim and demonstrated their power over them. It also suggests that the attack in the bathroom was a continued as a course of action once her body was out in the woods. It is not clear to me, based on the information that I have, whether she was dead or alive at the time that she...
Motion to strike.
The objection sustained. The motion to strike is granted.
Doctor, does it impact your conclusion in this case, whether she was dead or alive?
The fact that there were few...
Objection, non-responsive.
I think it's going to be, but just in case, why don't you answer that last question, yes or no?
Does the distinction of whether she was dead or alive, yes or no, impact your conclusion in this case?
Yes.
How so?
It impacts my conclusion because if she were dead at the time of the attack, then this sexual assault with the foreign object would have occurred post-mortem, which is an extremely low base rate event and suggests an intense emotional state focused upon a sense of complete domination and control over a victim and their humiliation. If she was alive at the time that she was taken, it means that he made a concerted decision, although aware that she was still alive, to continue a fatal attack.
And doctor, does anything about the condition of Ms. Ritzer when she's found or the scene in the woods undermine your conclusion that he was not suffering from a mental disease or defect on October 22nd?
No. In fact, the positioning of the body and some of the other events would suggest otherwise, actually.
How so?
In sexual homicides, it is not uncommon for the perpetrator then to sexually pose and position the victim. Unconscious or dead bodies are difficult to maneuver. They're heavy. And in this particular case, my view of the crime scene photograph suggests that she had been sexually positioned in this kind of pose. and that part of that was the sort of framing around some fallen fencing, it appeared to be, and then the positioning of the stick at her vaginal area.
And is that, you know, the layperson would think that's a crazy thing to do. In your training and experience, in your opinion as a clinical psychologist, is that, or a forensic psychologist, is that a crazy thing to do?
Posing the body is something that is done in sexual homicides by persons who do not have a mental illness.
And in fact, is it conduct you would expect from someone who's experiencing disorganization in thought?
Objection.
As to that question, I'll overrule the objection.
It does not. It is possible to have some degree of disorganization and still sexually pose a body. However, the posing of the body with then at least some effort to hide it with leaves and sticks and dirt, and the distribution of objects some distance away from where the body was and some effort to hide them would suggest that time was taken to do this. There was at least some degree of thought to do this. In and of itself, it would not suggest to me that this would be an indicator of psychosis, for example.
If we could return.
Can I say counsel?
If we could return to video 47, Doctor, in the next couple. If we could play one more. Doctor, the series of videos that just played, were they significant to you in forming your opinion regarding the defendant's criminal responsibility in this case?
Yes.
How so?
The defendant is seen on the earlier clips of the videotape returning back into the building. As he walks across the parking lot, is walking in a fairly leisurely but purposeful manner. He picks up speed a little bit as he goes into the building, but is not making a mad dash through the building. He walks in a purposeful manner, retrieves something from his locker. I can't tell what it is precisely he's retrieving because the door obscures it, but he then enters a bathroom that's nearby, changes his clothes. To the extent to which he may have had debris or blood on the clothing following the attack in the woods. Changing his clothing would be both an indicator that he was aware that if he was seen particularly with blood and so forth on his shoes or on his pants, he might be an object of suspicion or concern, and also suggests sort of deliberate furtherance of a course of action by going and changing his clothes in order to hide his involvement and to, and I'll just stop there, in order to hide his involvement.
And Doctor, you're familiar with the video that follows this where the defendant ultimately returns to the woods for a period of time and ultimately the jeans and t-shirt are recovered from the woods, is that correct?
Correct.
And then are you familiar both with video and the account of a Kevin Hebert who the defendant spoke to once he emerged from the woods again?
Yes.
And was there anything, starting with the apparent discarding of the jeans and the t-shirt in the woods, was that significant to you in forming your opinion?
It was.
How so?
It was because he, by taking his clothing out of the school, is removing from the scene of the attack or the nearby bathroom clothing related to the attack, which may have had blood or debris or other evidence on it. The statement by Mr. Hebert, whom he encounters, was significant to me because Mr. Hebert, who is a student at this school and an acquaintance of Mr. Phillips from their church group, he described Mr. Chism as being absolutely unremarkable. He was normal. He looked normal. They had a brief conversation about going to a church-related event later that weekend. The conversation ended and Mr. Chism went off. Mr. Hebert apparently thought nothing of this encounter until he was later asked to describe it to the police.
And Doctor, you're familiar that eventually after making his way through the school, Mr. Chism ends up making some purchases with Ms. Fritzer's credit card in the area of Endicott Street.
Correct.
Is there anything significant about that his use of her credit card to go to a movie and go to Wendy's, that was significant to you?
Yes.
How so?
It was significant to me because it, I thought, supported an inference that while there was a considerable, that there was evidence for preparation and planfulness for the attack, that as often happens in these kinds of homicides, careful planning for the post-attack phase was not good, was not complete. It is not possible for me, on the basis of information that I have, to know whether this was largely a function of failure to plan a post-attack departure from the scene, or whether it was, as sometimes happens as time goes by, a person who has fled a crime scene, as the minutes or hours go by, they become more confident that they have escaped detection. or some combination of the both.
And as they become more confident they've escaped detection, do they get sloppy?
Sometimes they get sloppy. Sometimes it can reflect, quite frankly, a kind of either an ambivalence about the attack or a certain kind of grandiosity about their invincibility. And I can't distinguish between those in this particular case.
In addition to the purchases made, you've reviewed video from BJ's where the defendant apparently successfully shoplifted a knife. Is that correct?
Yes.
And was that significant to you at all, particularly on the issues of whether he understood the wrongfulness of his conduct and could comport his behavior?
Yes. It was significant to me in that he engaged in a successful shoplift. He was not someone, for example, who was so disorganized or unthoughtful that he simply walked into a store while acutely mentally ill and started walking out with merchandise. He successfully engineered a shoplift that permits the inference that he would have known that even stealing a knife from a BJ's would be considered wrong or a crime, at least by others. And he also managed to enter and exit the store without any overt signs that drew any particular attention to himself.
And how is that significant?
That was significant to me because if he were acutely psychotic and highly disorganized, the odds that he would be able to enter and exit a place where people were viewing him without being noticed in some way, or at least having that observable on videotape is pretty small.
And Doctor, moving on, you are familiar with the accounts of Mr. Chism being located and taken into custody in Topsfield, is that correct?
That's correct.
And what, if any, significance did you have from those accounts in forming your ultimate opinion?
The Topsfield police described him as staring straight ahead, sort of with a flat emotional state, that he was, at least initially, sort of evasive and unresponsive to their questions, but ultimately he was responsive, gave his name, and so forth. They searched him because they were concerned that he might have been armed. They found some things belonging to Ms. Ritzer amongst those possessions, and one that was a particular concern to me was what apparently turned out to be her underwear.
And why was that a particularly concern to you or particularly significant to you?
That was particularly significant to me because in sexual homicides, one of the things that perpetrators will not uncommonly do is to take what sometimes gets called in the literature a trophy or souvenir. It's intended to keep the memory of the victim and the assault with them over time. And
Doctor, I want to return to the testing that you had Dr. Hebben do. With respect to the MMPIA, that testing did reveal certain symptoms of a mental illness, is that if you put aside the malingering, is that correct?
That's correct.
Based on those symptoms reported in the MMPIA, how would you have expected the defendant to appear when you were meeting with him in that same time frame?
I'm sorry, which time frame, Counselor?
You were meeting with him
Yes.
during the same period of time when Dr. Hebben was testing him, is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And based on the symptoms that were reported in the MMPIA, in the event that they weren't a result of malingering, what would you have expected to see when you were sitting down with Mr. Chism?
I would have expected to see someone that was pretty emotionally unstable and dysregulated, who might respond with verbal or physical aggression to frustration, who would be impulsive, behave in a reckless manner, and generally looked pretty behaviorally and emotionally disturbed. The number of symptoms that he reported would have suggested a pretty turbulent picture of behavior and emotion at that time.
And in fact, during the 13 hours you spent with Mr. Chism, did you ever see evidence of that kind of disease process?
No.
Doctor, based on your evaluation in this case and everything that you reviewed and the time you spent with Mr. Chism, did you form an opinion to a reasonable degree of psychological certainty as to whether Mr. Chism was experiencing auditory hallucinations when in your presence?
Yes.
What was that opinion?
I could not 100% rule out the possibility, but the probability would have been extremely low. If he was hearing them, they were not impacting upon his behavior or his decisions with me, as near as I could discern, and they were not compromising his ability to interact in a meaningful way with me.
Now, Doctor, you talked about that based on your review in particular of his family records, there were some diagnoses you wanted to rule in or rule out before reaching your final decision in this case. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And specifically, I think you said, but correct me if I'm wrong, you wanted to rule out schizoaffective disorder.
That's correct.
Can you describe, let me ask you this, what's a differential diagnosis?
Differential diagnosis is when you try and decide which diagnosis is the best fit for the clinical picture that's in front of you.
And in fact, in this case, did you contemplate a number of different differential diagnoses?
I did.
And can you describe the process for the jury that you went through to rule in or rule out each of those possible diagnoses?
The first thing that I did was review all of the history available to me in Mr. Chism's history. Family, school, peers, sports activities, other sorts of things, to try and get a sense of his functioning over time. I then took into consideration the self-reports of symptoms that he was giving to me. And I took into consideration testing and tried to sort of use this and other information to sort of put together what would be the most likely possible diagnoses. So amongst the ones that I considered, and I'll apologize in advance for using words that start a lot with schiz. That's largely an accident of history, as psychiatry was trying to sort out what all these different diagnoses were. But because of the intensity of what he was describing, although inconsistently over time, his auditory hallucinations and his sort of blunt emotional state with me, I considered the possibility of a brief reactive psychosis. I ruled that out because the symptom picture was not entirely consistent with a brief reactive psychosis, and when people do experience a brief reactive psychosis, they typically present as extremely emotionally turbulent and extremely confused, and Mr. Chism with me was neither one of those. It would also have been a relatively low base rate event because it's twice as often diagnosed in females, and the average age of onset is in the mid-30s, so he would have been unusual for that. But even if I had accepted the symptom picture as presented, he did not meet the other qualifiers for the diagnosis. I considered schizoid personality disorder. A personality disorder is a long-standing pattern of behaving associated with the person's personality features that creates difficulty in their interactions in the world and in their functioning. A schizoid personality disorder is one in which a person really is indifferent to human relatedness, human relationships. They're simply not interested in people. They prefer solitary activities. They're not particularly interested in intimate or sexual relationships with people. They don't really particularly care one way or the other how people judge them, either positively or negatively. Some people with schizoid personality disorder may go on to develop a psychotic disorder, but most do not. And Mr. Chism did not meet all of the criteria for a schizoid personality disorder. For example, people who have schizoid personality disorder really do prefer solitary activities. You would not typically see, for example, an adolescent with a schizoid personality using their time to go skateboarding with other people or playing on soccer teams. That just requires too much interpersonal interaction that they really don't want. Because of some of the content of his thoughts to me, reported to me, I considered schizotypal personality disorder. The schizotypal personality is similar to a schizoid personality in that they really are not particularly interested in human interaction with people. But that is driven more by both anxiety. They're more anxious around people. They don't know how to communicate with people particularly well. And it kind of matters to them whether or not people judge them favorably or disfavorably. The other reason that they don't interact well with people is that they commonly have eccentricities and oddities of thought. They may have very unusual interests or very sort of unusual belief systems that to which they adhere, and that they become so wrapped up in them that it's often difficult to have just sort of common conversation with them because they just want to talk to you about the things that they're interested in. Those things are pretty odd. If they find somebody else who is interested in the same thing, they can talk to each other forever about it, but they're not going to wander much into each other's personal lives because they really don't care about all that very much. He did not meet criteria for schizotypal personality disorder for a variety of reasons. One is that he does not have other symptoms associated with it, like ideas of reference. Ideas of reference are when you think that, for example, a blue car stopped at an intersection, and all of a sudden you know somehow that that blue car means something for your life. Like, that blue car stopped, I better double down on the lottery today, right? So those are not uncommon that people have these sorts of things, but people with schizotypal personality disorders often have trouble because of the frequency with which they actually act on these ideas. They also express social anxiety, which I did not observe in Mr. Chism in his interactions with me. So
I'm just going to direct you a little bit, Doctor.
Sure.
Doctor, with respect to the psychotic disorders, did you have a differential diagnosis regarding the psychotic disorders?
Yes. I looked specifically at schizophrenia, and because of the family history and the reports of mood symptoms, schizoaffective disorder, he did not meet the threshold criteria, in my view, for either of those disorders.
And what about mood disorders? Did you examine those?
I did examine those. I thought that there was some evidence, but primarily based upon subjective self-report, of a possible mood disorder of a mild to moderate nature.
And was your assessment of a subjective self-report colored at all by the results of Dr. Heaven's testing and your own observations?
By the time I had started to consider the possibility of a mood component, I had not received the testing results back yet, so I couldn't have been colored by them at that time. And by the time I received them, I had already formed an opinion that seemed to be consistent with her testing, but it didn't really shape my differential diagnosis of a mood disorder.
Now, Doctor, fair to say one of the other areas you considered were dissociative disorders. Is that correct?
That's true.
To that end, did you do any particular testing yourself?
I did.
Specifically, did you administer a DES for adolescents?
Yes, the Dissociative Experiences Scale for Adolescents.
And can you explain to the jury what that test is?
Yes. Dissociative disorders are disorders in which the person experiences disturbances of ongoing identity, memory, and their continuity of consciousness, if you will, identity, memory, and sort of ongoing sense of them being themselves. Dissociative experiences are not all that uncommon in ordinary people. Many of us had the experience of really being thinking about something and driving down the highway, and then all of a sudden realizing, you've hit your exit. And if I were to ask you, what did you drive by? How many pickup trucks were there? How many, big cargo trucks were you would have no idea, but you somehow managed to, without being focused consciously on the road, to steer your car down the road without crashing. Right? So that's kind of a relatively common dissociation of your actual behavior from your ongoing memory tracking, pretty common. At the extreme of dissociative disorder is what used to be called multiple personality disorder or dissociative identity disorder, so is what it's called now. And these are individuals who experience themselves in sharply discrete fragments that are referred to as alters. They typically experience amnesias. The so-called host personality will experience amnesias or distortions for what has occurred while the individual has been replaced, if you will, by the alter. Alters can have their own sets of beliefs, their own preferences in behavior, their own preferences of gender, clothing, and in extreme cases. And there can be many, many alters.
And the test that you did, what is that test designed to elicit?
The test is a screen for dissociative experiences. It asks the person who is taking the measure to look at roughly 30, 28, or 30 items and answer the question, how frequently do you experience these? And it goes from 1 to 10. And presumably you can leave it blank, in which case it would be scored a 0. But so somebody endorsing a particular item at 10 is essentially telling the evaluator that I experience this dissociative symptom 100% of the time. And you're allowed to sort of calibrate.
And what were the results of Mr. Chism's, or were there any difficulties with the results of Mr. Chism's testing on the DES for adolescents?
The score that Mr. Chism yielded on the dissociative experiences scales for adolescents was roughly double of what the score is for adolescents who have been confidently diagnosed with a dissociative identity disorder.
Why doesn't that mean that he's off the charts for having a personality disorder? I'm sorry, for having a dissociative disorder, I apologize.
Because a person who would be experiencing that intensity and frequency of symptoms over that much of the course of their day would look extremely confused, dysregulated. They often, when they're in that state, look frightened. So for example, people who have the dissociative symptom of often finding themselves in places where they have no idea how they got there or who they're with. This is anxiety-provoking for people. And so over the course of 13 hours, I looked for these kinds of shifts in emotion, in affect state. I didn't see shifts in behavior. I didn't see shifts in emotional state that you would see at that extreme. I did not see, amongst his belongings, for example, discontinuities in things like handwriting. People who have dissociative identity disorder, different alters will have different handwriting. Or a wildly varying set of interests that shifted rapidly over the course of his life and adolescence. I did observe some potential anomalies of memory or difficulties with memory, but I thought they were better accounted for by other hypotheses.
And doctor, did you ultimately, based on the DES and other observations, rule out a dissociative disorder?
Yes, although I didn't rely heavily on the DES findings to rule it out, because any tool is best used when you can confirm it by outside observation of how the person is actually behaving or how their functioning is impacted. And so my ruling out of a dissociative disorder was largely because I could not find in his history the kinds of histories of severe and chronic maltreatment that are associated with the development of dissociative disorder. Could not find evidence of a neurologically driven dissociative state, and I did not observe either in his history nor in his time with me the kinds of presentations that would support dissociative disorder diagnosis.
Doctor, when you were evaluating Mr. Chism, he was 16 years old, is that correct?
That's correct.
And at the time of this offense, he was 14 years old, is that correct?
That's correct.
How did that age and development factor at all into your ultimate conclusions in this case? And what did you take into account?
I took into account his course of development up till age 14, and then the circumstances of his life following October 2013, when he was largely he was entirely in facilities-based care, which has a developmental impact on young people. I took into account his opportunities for physical and cognitive and emotional maturation between 14 and 16. This is one of the reasons when you have sort of an adolescent who's a moving target anyway, if you're trying to get back to what this person looked like at a specific time, you want to rely as much as possible on observations, testing, and so forth that are in that time period. Adolescents can be moving targets developmentally.
Now, Doctor, based on all of the evaluation you did and everything you reviewed, believe you've already testified to this, but you formed an opinion to a reasonable degree of psychological certainty as to the issue of criminal responsibility on October 22nd.
I did.
And what was that opinion?
My opinion is that at the time of the offense, that Mr. Chism was not suffering from the requisite mental disease or defect, although he may have exhibited some symptoms of psychological distress or disturbance, but that in any event, whatever he may have been experiencing in that time was not sufficient to substantially impair his capacities to appreciate the wrongfulness or criminality of the attack on Colleen Ritzer, nor to have conformed his conduct to the requirements of law.
They did not impact his ability to conform his conduct.
That's correct.
I have nothing further for Dr. Kincher.
Thank you, Counsel.
Good afternoon, Dr. Kincher.
Good afternoon, Counselor.
Now, whenever you evaluate a juvenile, you consider adolescent brain development, correct?
That's correct.
And how is your consideration of adolescent brain development based in the scientific research that's been done on the brain?
Yes.
And what is well accepted about the differences between do adolescent brains differ significantly from adult brains?
On average, yes.
And so the questions I'm going to be asking you about what is known about adolescent brains generally, not about Philip Chism's brain, okay?
Understood.
All right. So what is the physical process that distinguishes an adolescent's brain from an adult brain?
At the onset of puberty, the brain begins quite dramatic restructuring as the hormones that influence the adolescent's body also work on the nervous system. And so what you see is essentially a reorganization of the adolescent's brain largely between the ages of about, well, whenever the onset of puberty is for a child, and the early 20s, although at least in males it goes into the mid-20s. Amongst the things that we see is a reorganization of the relationship between the midbrain, which is the center of the brain which is responsible for threat assessment, emotion, fear, sort of basic appetites and drives and the like, and the frontal lobe. There is a period of time in which the midbrain has developed and the frontal lobes will still be relatively undeveloped. One person once put it to me, if you want to sort of understand adolescence, one model of thinking about it on average, and there's a huge range in adolescence, of course, is kind of like putting the brakes of a small car on a mid-size or large family car. You're going to have inefficiencies as a result of that that are reflected in things like a greater proclivity towards impulsivity and the like.
So juveniles tend to be, the brain development issues is linked to juveniles being more impulsive, correct?
On average, yes.
And more likely to take risks?
Yes.
And more likely to perceive threats?
More likely to?
Perceive threats?
No, that's true if the adolescents have also had a significant trauma history. Adolescents with that kind of history are more likely to perceive threats than even other adolescents, actually.
And one of the differences between say a 14-year-old and a 25-year-old is making considered judgments and reflecting on options and plausible consequences, correct?
It depends upon the context in which the decision is being made. By mid-adolescence, most adolescents, although certainly not all of them, are able to make decisions that are relatively similar to those of adults in what are called conditions of cool decision making. Cool decision making is what occurs when somebody sits down and thinks about it. Adolescents are actually pretty good if they have the involvement in their decision making of a concerned adult, for example, or somebody who can help kind of slow them down while they reason themselves to a conclusion. They are worse than adults on average, and again, there's a huge range here, when they're asked to make decisions under so-called hot cognition decisions. Hot cognition decisions are times in which they are distressed, emotionally aroused, and feel as though they need to respond relatively immediately to something in their environment.
I just need a minute.
Sure.
Now, this research is based on brain scans that are done of studies that are done via brain scans, correct?
It's done both with brain scans but also decision-making behavioral research conducted largely by psychologists.
And the brain scans are MRIs, correct? And also CAT scans and other types of scans.
Yes, although I'll have to acknowledge that the scan technology is not in my technical bailiwick. But yes, those are the kinds of things that they use.
And research has also found that that there are changes in the volume of different areas of the brain in people suffering from schizophrenia, correct?
You can. I'll see count.
Are you familiar with the DSM-5?
I'm familiar with it, yes.
And is it something that you use regularly?
When making diagnosis, yes.
And it's an established source of information for psychologists and psychiatrists, correct?
Yes.
And in fact, the DSM-5 states that reduced overall brain volume has been observed, and as well as increased brain volume reductions with age in schizophrenics, correct?
That's true, but the DSM also cautions that a diagnosis of schizophrenia cannot be made on the basis of laboratory testing given the existing state of the science.
Correct, but brain volume reductions are associated with schizophrenia, correct?
It's a little more complicated than that. Brain volume reductions are associated with schizophrenia. They're associated with normal aging. They're associated with a lot of different conditions. So that's true as far as it goes, but it's not pathognomic or specific to schizophrenia.
Now, you did not order any brain scans of Philip Chism, correct?
That's correct.
And if you did order brain scans and the brain scans showed significant reduction in volume in certain areas of the brain, that would be something you would consider, correct?
I would consider it. I would refer to neurology to see if there was any impact on actual functioning.
And you did not request a brain scan, correct?
It's not clear to me that I would be able to. I'm not a physician. I'm a psychologist, but I did not, to be fair to your point, I did not seek one.
If I could have a moment.
Sure.
It's fair to say, Dr. Kincherf, that diagnosis of mental illness in childhood and adolescence is tricky under the best circumstances, correct?
I would agree with that.
And teenagers are constantly in the process of developing, correct?
I would agree with that.
And they are a moving target for professionals attempting to diagnose them, correct?
That's true.
I have nothing further.
Sure.
One question. Doctor, everything you've testified to regarding the juvenile brain development, did you have all of that in mind when reaching your opinions in this case regarding Philip Chism?
Absolutely.
I have nothing. I have nothing.
All right. Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you, Your Honor.
All right. Ms. McDougall?
Pending a stipulation which Ms. Regan is signing, which was actually already read to the jury at my case in chief, the Commonwealth rests again.
Okay. All right, thank you. Could I see counsel at the sidebar, please? Ladies and gentlemen, what we're going to do to use your time well, and rather than have you spend a lot of time sitting around tomorrow, is just have you come in Friday for closing arguments, for if there's other evidence, closing arguments, and charge. I would say that you'd be a deliberating jury. Without promising you anything, on Friday, I'm going to estimate 12:30, but I feel like it will be before lunch, that you'll have the case and be deliberating on Friday. Don't come here tomorrow. Please don't go to work tomorrow. This is considered a jury day for all the reasons that you understand it being a jury day, but don't go to work. You want to stay away from anyone who might want to try and talk to you about the case. Don't come tomorrow. Friday morning, we'll bring you into court at 9 o'clock, and I hope, but do not, you'll get the case Friday. I hope, but do not promise that it's going to be before lunch. Don't discuss the case among yourselves or with anybody else. Don't do any independent investigation concerning this case, or avoid any information from any source other than in the courtroom, and the jurors are excused until Friday at 9 o'clock, not tomorrow.
All right. Hear ye, hear ye, hear ye. All persons having anything further to do before the Honorable David Lowy, Justice of the Superior Court, now sitting at Salem within and for this county of Essex at present, depart and give your attendance at this place Friday morning next at 9 a.m. to its time and place. The sitting of this court is now adjourned.